Hi guys, welcome to our second class of our DevOps series around environment management. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to trickle in and we'll get started.
All right, it seems like people are coming in. We'll just wait another minute or two before we get started.
All right guys, welcome again to our second class of the series. We're going to be talking about environment management. Just a couple of housekeeping messages before we start. You will be muted, but please feel free to raise your hand with any questions and I'll make sure to unmute you and you can ask whatever it is you wanted to ask. If you're running out speak up, you can always drop your questions in the little box and I'll make sure that the question gets to my presenter. Lastly, we'll be recording and you'll be receiving a recording of this tomorrow. Quick introductions. I'm Shannon and I'm the demand generation coordinator here at Prodly. And today we'll be speaking is Derek Black and he's the director of customer experience. So I'll give the word to Derek.
Yeah, hi. Nice to see everyone pouring in today. Today we're going to talk about where the magic happens in all of kind of environment management and DevOps and best practice lifecycle management for Salesforce. So thanks a lot for joining today. Hopefully we can learn a lot about environment strategy. That's the topic of the day, which really sets the stage for all admin and developer work. And again, like where the magic happens, where you're actually going to be building and doing things in your orgs and your sandboxes. By learning the best practices of environment management, your Salesforce team can work in better harmony and get features to production faster, deliver a better experience for your end users, and not really annoy each other by stepping on each other's toes in different environments. Salesforce provides a lot of environments and sandbox types to their customers to get work done, but not a lot of tools to best use them. So today we'll learn about how to optimize usage of these environments. And by making the most of these environments available to you, the technical execution of DevOps on Salesforce becomes much easier. Again, we have these 6 phases and items to consider regarding application lifecycle management, or ALM. If you hear me say ALM, I'm referring to the general process of application lifecycle management, which is how people manage and do things on any large business application. So environment strategy impacts almost all of these individual phases. It will dictate when and where you develop changes, how you allocate resources for unit testing, where releases are packaged, and how items that pass or fail these are being promoted or rebuilt. It will also dictate how you manage training and production hotfixes. So executing on environment management strategy in a best-in-class manner can also help with prioritization by giving multiple paths for long-term and short-term work. And to get a better feel of where everyone is at in their environment strategy, we'll be asking a number of poll questions throughout this presentation. The first up is what types of sandboxes are you using? And you can pick as many of these as you would like. A lot of interesting feedback coming in the poll right now. So that looks good. Shannon, I don't know if we like closed the poll to show the results or how that worked.
Yes, we have almost all votes in, so I'll be closing the poll shortly.
All right.
Right.
Ooh, we finally got a vote for Scratchword right at the very end there. So I think it stopped my presentation though. So let me go back to sharing. Oh yeah, it's still there. Okay, cool. So, you know, most people are using full copies in here. We have a decent amount of dev.org use, a little bit of Scratch.org use, and, you know, kind of a mix of what's going on with like dev pros and partial copies kind of in there. So in order to define an environment strategy, it's important to understand what tools you have in your toolbox. And it's good to see that 92% of people are actually using dev sandboxes. We'll quickly overview, you know, what's available in Salesforce and really kind of a mixture of what's actually going on in real world use versus what Salesforce recommends as best practice and what I have seen works the best in my interactions with literally hundreds of Salesforce customers and implementations. The most familiar to people will probably be the full copy sandbox, and from the poll results, you say that 85% of you are using them. I know that oftentimes these are most often, you know, the go-to environments for development as well as testing. Most companies will have at least one, and some people are lucky to have multiples. Some people I've worked with have, you know, like a dozen or close to 20 full copies, which I don't know exactly how they afford that, but it does happen. While these are commonly used for starting new work, they should really only be used for testing and potentially training or bigger initiatives where you want to just have real stable data or a copy of production. Their ability to perfectly mirror production makes them the best places to do things like UAT, which is user acceptance testing, or systems integration testing. And by minimizing the moving parts inside of your full copy sandboxes, which means, you know, not building new things inside of them all the time, really just focusing on package releases into them, you can pinpoint what work items are performing well or failing a lot easier, as well as best evaluate the impact of a deployment to production. So if you use a full copy, a great use for it is for a staging environment to just evaluate the impact of, hey, we're going to do a very large deployment into production. Let's do a mock run of that into a full copy sandbox to just make sure that we're not going to blow anything up. The next type of sandbox, partial sandboxes, they're, you know, a lot of times almost just as good as full copies for some smaller companies. If you're small, you'll be able to get pretty close to production by using the sandbox templates where you pick what type of data you want to roll into your partial copy. For larger companies, partial copies become closer in utility to the Dev Pro or Dev Sandbox because of the data volumes in a, you know, company that has thousands of users. You're not going to get very much in a partial copy. So it's nice that they can immediately receive some data from production, but you cannot pick exactly what records you want to end up in the partial copy. Salesforce will send over the first 10,000 records it finds for any given object. So it'll leave a lot of useful data out of the sandbox. So if you have 100,000 accounts, you're going to get 10% of that data, and you might miss out on some really key customers or something like that that you do a lot of testing on. So the size of your company will kind of dictate the usefulness of this type of sandbox in your environment strategy. Since partial copies may cost extra and are not as plentiful as developer sandboxes, you want to use them for tasks that may require a large amount of record data across many objects. So UAT or integration testing will be better use of a partial copy than starting to build out dev work in them oftentimes. These are also good if you have a large amount of app exchange packages or metadata customizations in production. In some rare occasions, some production org metadata cannot fit into a dev pro or a dev sandbox. So partial copies can be a good choice to start dev work in complex scenarios where you require a lot of metadata, a lot of package data that it maybe just won't fit inside of some of these smaller dev pro or dev sandboxes. The next type of sandbox that's available is, of course, dev pro sandboxes. They fit in this last scenario mentioned with partial copies. If your production org has a large amount of metadata in it, or you want to do some integration testing on like load testing, pushing through large amount of record data, the 1 GB storage limit will help you with some of these aspects over top of just a dev sandbox that only has 200 megabytes. Since the use of these dev pro sandboxes is pretty niche, they're probably the least used type of sandbox, and that kind of corresponds with our poll numbers. Out of the actual sandboxes, we have 46% of people using dev pros. So, they're not really necessarily a go-to resource, but in some scenarios, they can be pretty useful. Dev sandboxes and scratch orgs are the best place to start doing any type of work, any type of new admin work, new development work. We'll kind of get to the caveats and differences between the two in a bit. It seems like a lot of people are just not using scratch orgs or not familiar with them potentially. Since these environments are kind of readily available and cheap, they're the best place to start any build work, and it will enable you to adopt an environment per feature strategy that we talked a little bit about in the last session of whenever someone is going to start doing some type of new work, it's best practice and recommended by Salesforce and of course myself to create a new org for that resource, that developer or admin to start their work. So by using these environments to start and segment work, you eliminate complications that come around for multiple people working in the same environment. And there's really no more waiting on work to be completed to do a refresh, and no more worrying about undoing other people's changes and things like that if you adopt these as the starting point. To talk a little bit about how dev and scratch orgs are different, scratch orgs are really like the future of sandboxes in Salesforce. Kind of a story I like to tell around this is maybe if you've been in the Salesforce ecosystem around more than a decade or so, like I have, around like 2012, 2013, there was really this big push to move to Lightning. Hey, Lightning's new. It's going to, optimize and revolutionize the way that people can interact with their data in Salesforce. And around that time, it was a cool new thing. It wasn't really well adopted. There wasn't really like a push to get people on it. But around like the following 5 years or so to about 2017 or so, nearly everyone was on Lightning, and like every single new implementation Salesforce was built completely on Lightning. Well, what we're going to see with scratch orgs and DX, so scratch orgs are a part of Developer Hub in Salesforce, which is the starting point for Salesforce DX. DX is going to become more and more prevalent in Salesforce, just like Lightning did. So DX has kind of made its debut, about like 4 years ago or so, as something to be considering. It's a bit more slow of a burn than some of the Lightning considerations, but scratch orgs are built on a different backend platform than dev sandboxes. which allows them to be created on demand. There's no more waiting around for hours or sometimes even days to have an environment to use. Scratch orgs also have the ability to configure what metadata is loaded into them. So it's possible to pick subsets of managed packages or metadata components to be put into their creation. So this can help you do targeted work in free or cheap environments without having to worry about storage limitations. You can tailor and scope down what's actually going into these orgs for specific people to work on things. So, this gives you some extra flexibility over developer sandboxes, and you can allow people to have like tailored Scratch orgs to just work on Service Cloud, or work only on Sales Cloud, or work only with Pardot, or CPQ or other managed packages. And they really become a great go-to source for starting any new work in a Salesforce implementation. And this brings us to our next poll question. Where are you starting most of your new work in Salesforce? I like watching this race take off.
And we're almost there. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds.
All right, great.
All right.
So this is pretty good to see. We have 75% of our people starting work in DevOrg, which is aligned with the best practices recommended by Salesforce. This chart here is a chart of recommendations that comes directly from Salesforce. We made it look like our own template here, but this is from a Salesforce presentation on how to best use sandboxes and in the scope of application lifecycle management. So, this is with the assumption that there's no other supporting tools being used to manage or set up these sandboxes. And these are the things that they would recommend doing. So build should always maybe start in a Scratch org, developer org, or dev pro. And you can see that it really is not recommended that you start this type of work in partial or full copies. And I'll talk a little bit more about how maybe like your team size might dictate that, and how you might want to consider or have it like in your back pocket of how to start maybe better using DevOrgs to start your work. But with other tools on the market like Prodly, it's possible to cover more use cases inside of Scratch orgs, DevOrgs, DevPros, because we allow you to sync metadata and data between all orgs. So we can really extend the functionality of Scratch orgs, developer and dev pro sandboxes to be more like partial or full copy sandboxes. You can get all of the targeted data you want inside of a dev org or a Scratch org to make those easier to use. So DevOps and environment management tools can make it easier, just less scary to start working in those sandboxes that don't by default have all production data in them. Adopting DevOps tools for sandbox seeding will allow you to continue the comfort and familiarity of starting build work in a full or partial copy without really diminishing the value of those expensive resources. So, a full copy can cost many thousands, and I've heard in some cases people paying over $1 million for a full copy sandbox. You really want to use those for having a mirror of production all the time and refreshing those as often as possible. And by moving to doing more work and starting things in DevOrgs or Scratch orgs, it allows you to get the more full value out of those expensive resources, while also, using something like Prodly or, potentially like a data loader to seed data into a developer org or a Scratch org probably gets you to the same level and reason of why you would be just starting directly in a full copy. So this leads us to yet another poll question. I think we have 5 in all today. Are you currently seeding sandboxes as part of your environment strategy?
All right, and so that incoming, I'll give it a couple of seconds before I close our poll.
All right.
Right.
Okay, so most people are not. Some people are doing it with data, but not metadata. And some people are doing it with both data and metadata, which is great. So like seeding sandboxes allows you to, get more out of these dev and scratch orgs, as well as maybe share data between dev orgs for parallel deployments and development, which we'll talk about a bit more. So along with the suggested uses for sandbox types, this is the most basic overview of how Salesforce recommends using them. It's outlined in this slide. All new work should really start in a dev org or a scratch org and be merged into a dev pro or a partial, where you package together things to do bigger testing inside of a full copy or sometimes another partial copy sandbox. This is of course kind of an ideal world scenario. So before we kind of start a further discussion around what we see in real life versus this ideal, we have yet another poll question. How many developer and or scratch orgs is your organization using right now? No one's addicted to orgs yet. Oh, some people are finally addicted to orgs. It's great. I've only seen one, actually two Salesforce customers using all of their like free 100 dev orgs and then scratch orgs on top of that.
All right, let's give it a couple seconds and I'll be closing this poll as well.
Cool. I won't give away the name of the company that's using all their orgs, but I will say that they are referenced in this deck eventually. They are a company that provides version control to people, so of course they're using everything. And this is more like what we're actually going to see a lot of times. You're going to, have, a dev org that is maybe actively being used, maybe one or two, and some that have been abandoned for many years, and probably 30 or 40 unused, sitting there dev orgs that you could be doing more stuff with. You'll have a partial copy sandbox that maybe you're using to merge some of this work into, that is probably refreshed kind of frequently because you're trying to get it in sync with production to make sure that you can merge these packages together. A lot of times I'll see full copies that have not even been refreshed in over a year. And it leads to some conflicts and challenges with verifying and understanding, what's going on in your release. What is the impact actually going to be? And, of course, there's a variety of reasons why these boxes are not always refreshed. And I think everyone probably does understand to a degree that they're most valuable when they're refreshed, because the key reason you want a full is to have a good mirror copy of production. And if it's not been refreshed, there's so many things going on in production. You're adding users, you're, potentially deploying in from other areas that are not necessarily going through this full copy sandbox all the time, that the mirrorness disappears. It starts degrading like the second after you have created or refreshed one of these full copy sandboxes. So by adopting more actually best practice of starting things in dev orgs or scratch orgs, and making those the place that you build new things, testing in an org before you push to a full copy, for just UAT or SIT and full, or maybe staging exercises, you allow yourself to refresh those fulls more often and get a bigger kind of ROI on having those expensive resources. So with talking about what Salesforce sees as ideal versus what is actually kind of going on. We're going to move into like a different topic now around CI/CD inside of Salesforce. So this is kind of an end result of getting to best-in-class environment strategy, is the ability to eventually implement a continuous integration, continuous deployment solution for Salesforce. So CI/CD is really kind of just like a software development term, and I'm seeing it become more and more popular inside of Salesforce. So this integration piece speaks to how the lower developer environments, the things that we're seeing here, like in the short-term and long-term projects area, how they kind of talk to one another and are sending the newest pieces that are approved back into kind of the feedback loop to make sure everyone has the latest and greatest stuff, and anything that they're building is not going to conflict with other work that's getting completed ahead of time of them. The deployment part of CI/CD, the continuous deployment, is having finished releases move to production in an automated, regular fashion. So the CI, the continuous integration, keeps your feature branches, these green dev orgs that you see in this slide here, in sync to get the most out of the environment per feature strategy that Salesforce recommends. And this allows for many different projects to be worked on simultaneously by keeping integration and testing orgs clean and as close to production as possible. You can minimize problems introduced by releases to production of like a continuous deployment or continuous delivery piece of that. So you can have peace of mind by having a really good staging environment that your continuous deployments to production are going to have only good impacts and minimize the negative impacts of something like that, introducing a bug to production.
I have a question coming in, Derek. How often do you see people actually use CI/CD inside of Salesforce?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's becoming more and more popular in larger enterprises where we have, let's say, more than 2,000 users. The Salesforce admin teams are really kind of on top of CI/CD, or they've either already implemented something to do this inside of Salesforce, or they're actively working on a project to get this type of application lifecycle management paradigm inside of Salesforce. And typically they're using version control systems to manage that. So they'll be using like a GitHub or GitLab, Bitbucket, something like that, to actually version all of their releases. So when we're talking about like this like environment per feature or environment per contributor paradigm, they are doing that. They are creating a lot of dev orgs and scratch orgs, syncing those to a version control system. And then when that contributor is done with their work, they push it to the version control, and they'll have a release manager, which could sometimes just be like another person on the team. They might not necessarily have a dedicated release manager. Check the work in the repository, push that to a merge org. So usually like a dev pro or a partial copy, package a release of whatever's got done through the whole team of that week, and do automated testing up the chain to make sure that whatever's being released that week is good to go for production. So I see it a lot in the enterprise space. So probably about around half of those companies have something in place or are working on this. Not so much with smaller teams, because honestly you just have too much to do. If you're on a team of like 1 to 5 people or something like that, you probably have a good idea of all the changes that are being made without needing to get too strong-armed into this. But if your company is expecting to grow, and we'll talk about fitting like a strategy to a team size in a little bit, these are some things you want to think about to consider in the future. So along with that, there are some CI/CD and parallel development tips and tricks I wanted to share. Just 3 little things here. as I kind of mentioned in response to that question, you want to create branches and a version control for every new development environment and have those sync together. So you can do compares to your main code base, your main metadata, your main configuration data changes inside of production that matter. You want to have a plan and tools in place to kind of do backward deployments. So that's the CI part of continuously integrating all of your development work to make sure completed changes are being pushed to development environments that everyone is working kind of on the latest and greatest framework that's going on in your Salesforce org. And you want to have standardized templates for data as well as metadata for development environments. So we don't have a lot of people here that are using Scratch orgs or familiar with that, but inside of Scratch orgs, as I may have mentioned earlier, you develop a template for what type of metadata you want in there. You can say, hey, I want these 5 managed packages, and I want all of the Sales Cloud objects to go in there, as well as, custom objects that I made myself. So stuff that's not part of a managed package. And that will go into the Scratch org. But you'll also want the appropriate data to go along with that. So if you're doing something in Service Cloud, you'll probably want to make sure that you have cases at least, maybe assets, knowledge articles potentially, different things like that that are seeded in there to avoid your, admins or developers clicking new over and over again, like new account, new contact, new opportunity. Prodly does provide tools to automatically seed that data into Scratch orgs, so you can have that full, picture. Everything looks like a partial or a full copy sandbox without having to kind of get on top of that big expense of paying for all that stuff. So, of course, I've alluded to this earlier, like the environment strategy is going to vary on the size of the company. From my experience, there are kind of 3 types of team strategies when applied to ALM on Salesforce. So smaller companies, they'll usually have like a 1 to 3 person team that's, they're likely able to survive and understand what all the contributors are doing without really needing to dive all the way into an environment per feature strategy. They can coexist, they can easily communicate maybe in a single partial or full copy. It's much more forgiving to do that, even though it's not necessarily recommended. You should probably be looking to adopt a bit better practices if you anticipate growth, and I'm sure that most small teams and small companies are hoping that they're gonna, double in the next 2 years or something like that. So by knowing the rules well, you can, know how to break the rules and the problems to look out for while, doing things that are maybe not recommended. As team sizes grow, you'll need to build a better strategy to keep work straight, and I think that's probably why we see most people are, using a good number of, dev orgs and starting work in their dev orgs. A single team will usually grow to be about 4 to 10 people before starting to split into multiple teams. So you'll have like 2 teams of 5 people, or 20 teams of 8 people, depending on how big of the company you're working at. So that's when you want to start considering and moving into this environment per feature or environment per resource. So like a resource would be like an admin or a developer. They'll each have their own dev org that they're working out of. So this becomes more important as you grow. You also start getting to the point where you have someone on the team who's dedicated as like a release manager or is picking up that role. You'll want to start thinking about that as you get to a bigger team size. And they're the people that are going to manage your full copy sandboxes that you're going to use for testing and packaging your releases that are going to go to production. Very large organizations will then start breaking into teams that are dedicated regions, and I rarely see these teams get more than 10 people or so. So you kind of fall back into this 4 to 10 person strategy, but with some larger oversight that are going to feed all that work into like a bigger team that's more dedicated to release management. I've worked with companies where there's over like 300,000 end users. and there's literally like 100 to 200 people on the Salesforce team. Been in some crazy meetings where we have 2 gigantic conference rooms just full of the Salesforce team, and 50 people on the the dial on a webinar or something like that to discuss impacts of major projects that they're working on. These teams will usually roll into like a dedicated center of excellence with release management resources, and overall more environments will be used as you step to production. So you're going to have these small teams kind of working only in dev boxes and promoting up to maybe their own integration dev box. Those will be rolled into full copy sandboxes, likely for systems integration testing, training, UAT, and of course staging is super important when you have that many end users. It also becomes more and more that in this day and age that version control becomes more of a necessity than a nice to have when you're working at that scale. The next thing that we're going to be moving to in this presentation is Salesforce DevOps Center, which will be a new tool from SalesOps for improving DevOps as well as general ALM strategy in Salesforce. And this brings us to our next poll question, which might be our last one. Maybe we have another one. Are you familiar with Salesforce DevOps Center? So we have some people saying that yes, they're familiar of it. Some people saying that they've heard of it but don't know what it is. Some people saying that this is the first time they're ever going to hear this fabled and highly anticipated tool.
All right, and voting is in, so I'll be closing the poll.
All right. So very good, thanks for responding. So to aid in all these recommendations that they've been throwing out and I've been going through this presentation, Salesforce wants people to adopt DX and Scratch orgs, and they want people to do this like, org per feature, org per user story type of development process. DevOps Center is going to aid in release management as well as governance and environment strategy for this. So currently this tool is in beta. So maybe some of the people that answered yes, maybe some of you are in the beta for using DevOps Center. But in the summer or maybe in the fall, they're going to make this generally available for free for all Salesforce customers, which would be nice. And it's going to kind of start on a way to organize what work your team is doing, as well as track changes across these orgs. So you can kind of maybe see in the screenshot that it's logging new changes that it's finding inside of orgs, and those are linked to, we have like work items up here that are ways that you're going to assign and distribute work to people on your team and say like, what is the completeness of it? And, what's actually being finished by your team. So it's going to be also kind of positioned as the future of change sets. So it will create and support a new paradigm for change management in Salesforce that better aligns to the general best practices for, really application lifecycle management, not necessarily the best practices that Salesforce is recommending, but also just the bigger concept of ALM that's, relevant to any business platform or any type of software development. And there's a question in the chat, like, how can we register for the beta version of DevOps Center? I think the registration is now closed. And what we've been told is you would need to talk to your Salesforce account executive or customer success manager around potentially getting into a closed beta. If you're a Prodly customer, we can maybe help you out with that a bit too. But to take advantage of all these great features and move away from change sets, there's some requirements for usage that we'll need to talk about, so you can consider whether or not you'll be able to adopt DevOps Center. So as you move to DevOps Center, you must use dev orgs or scratch orgs. You cannot fully depend on full copy or partial copy sandboxes. This is because you have to allow for changes to be tracked at a metadata level, and that feature is not available inside of full copy sandboxes. It's only available inside of dev orgs and scratch orgs. That is how they can pick up the differences between your production and your development environment and attach those back to the work items for deployment. You must also use a version control system, and that's currently limited to GitHub. So I know that they're looking to include Bitbucket and I think Azure as part of this as well. But right now, in order to use this, you have to push your work to a repository and then from the source control, move that up the landscape. Tying into this, you must follow a single pipeline for a path to production. So, well, you can actually define multiple pipelines, but they're really linear. So you can go from dev to SIT to UAT to production, or you can have a different endpoint that goes in. But you know, it gets really kind of rigidly defined on how you're going to do this, which, you know, all in all is fine. You know, something that people are following. But, you know, if you're not too structured or disciplined on how you're pushing things to production, this could be something to consider. There's a question, is this available for Dev Pro sandboxes? I don't think that the feature is enabled in Dev Pro sandboxes. I'm not entirely sure there. So you'd have to check on that and get back to you on that. And it requires, you know, refresh or creation of new environments to use. So that ties into the point one that you have to use developer scratch orgs. You can't just keep spitting off work inside the same partial copy all the time. And you can't really move data sideways or backwards with this. It does follow that single pipeline where it marches from dev to test to production or something like that. And it does something that's pretty nice is it overlays an approval process for all this. So when you finish some type of work and you move that to your repository, someone needs to approve that that work is done, which is great for some compliance or audit reasons that you might run into that we talked about in the governance presentation 2 weeks ago. But that could be really helpful. Once it's approved, that's when it starts to get pushed into orgs or version control systems, depending on which way it's going. There's a few challenges and benefits of here. So benefit, you'll be able to use more dev and scratch orgs in your ALM process. The challenge is that you need to seed and set up these orgs with test data and in-flight metadata. So sort of that backwards deployment or sideways deployment that we're talking about in the continuous integration part of CI/CD strategy. You know, that is a bit of a challenge and you would need some other external tooling potentially to manage that. It establishes, you know, a linear pipeline path to production. So, you know, allowing metadata syncs, again, like between all these lower environments can be a challenge for that. And, you know, it cannot track changes between multiple full copy sandboxes. So when you are moving to production and doing that type of paradigm, you really become limited to those packaged releases and making changes and modifications only in dev org. So like if something fails testing, you need to send that back to either the dev org that it was started in or create a new dev or scratch org to rebuild and fix that and deploy it back up the pipeline. It doesn't really allow for using this tool at least to pick up changes that are made inside of those full copies. So you would be back to either using change sets or doing some type of manual deployment there. So we'll kind of revisit this diagram again to talk about some environment strategy needs that DevOps Center is maybe not quite ready to solve. So like the multiple environments merging into a single source where we have devs and, you know, roll up to integration. That can be challenging if they're split between like long-term and short-term projects. You probably won't have the long-term project dev environments in the same pipeline as your short-term projects. And moving completed changes between these two is of course not supported because they're not in the same pipeline. Or you would need a very complex, strange pipeline strategy to manage this directly inside of DevOps Center for everything. So DevOps Center is going to be great for a lot of this, like where we see like roll up to staging to prod, like pushing things into a single integration org and moving up. It's going to be awesome for managing that as well as integrating with a version control. But it's going to need some time to cook to cover some more advanced use cases of using lots and lots of different developer orgs. So you might need auxiliary tooling to help you manage that.
Sorry to interrupt, Derek. I do see a question coming in, and they ask, what does the DevOps Center mean if you're already using a DevOps tool?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in some cases, it's likely going to be like a free version of what else is going on in there to already integrate your Salesforce changes into a version control system. You know, if that's what you're doing mostly with an existing DevOps tool, this will be a great way to potentially replace that tool. If there's some things you're doing with your current DevOps tooling that you know, don't meet the requirements or are a bit more advanced than what DevOps Center is doing, it's, you know, maybe better to stick with that tool in some cases than using DevOps Center. But, you know, if you're curious around buying something that is going to allow you to manage and version your metadata, I would consider DevOps Center because, you know, it's going to be free and they're going to continually improve it. So that would be, you know, what I would look to first. But yeah, if you have something in place, this is likely probably very similar to what you're using, and of course it's free. We're going to start wrapping up the session and talk through, you know, kind of a summary of what's best in class for environment strategy. I've said this, I feel like 1,000 times, but that we need to use this feature branch environment strategy of creating dev orgs for, you know, the changes that a single person is going to do that week or that month. You know, use Scratch orgs and developer orgs to start all the work. It seems like most people are doing that right now, which is great. You want to set up a fresh org for each admin or developer per sprint or user story. So that kind of ties into, you know, starting everything there. A best practice is to seed these sandboxes or Scratch orgs with what I call golden data. So like the, you know, 20 or 50 go-to accounts that you use maybe in a full copy to go test your changes or make sure that what you did isn't going to disrupt your largest customer or some specific use cases you have in Salesforce. Having you know, a set of data of those known accounts that you want to push into those sandboxes to get started, or sometimes configuration data for tools like Salesforce CPQ, Financial Force PSA. They require a bunch of record data that actually is the configuration of how everything works. You want to figure out a strategy to push those into those orgs so they perform and work more like a partial copy or a full copy. And of course, you need some type of strategy to sync metadata from the most recently completed releases back to these orgs, so everyone's picking up the cool new things that the rest of the team is working on. And then you want to merge work from these orgs into a testing org as soon as it's completed. So that is where you move from the CI to the CD of, you know, continuous deployment. Another strategy that's best in class is environment pooling. So having developer orgs ready in advance, so there's no delay in waiting for them to be spun up. I'm sure we've all run into that scenario where, oh, I need a new dev org today, but I'm still waiting on it to be provisioned, and sometimes it will literally take days for that to happen. So what you can do is just always have a few extra made. At the beginning of every week, just create 2 or 3 dev environments or refresh 2 or 3 dev environments that are not being used that will have them be ready there for you, and you don't have to wait to start your next units of work in there. And don't have to fully rely on refreshes for data and metadata syncs. If you have a tool like Prodly or something else in the DevOps space, you can push updated data and metadata from production or full copy or whatever into these other orgs in your environment pool to make sure that they're up to date. And Scratch orgs can help solve this issue by really just being immediately available. There's no waiting, so you don't really have to have them made in advance. They're made on demand, and no worries of it taking hours or days for you to have that available. You also want, and we haven't really talked about this a whole lot through the presentation, but you want production support and training environments. So to avoid muddying up your staging environment with either training data or trying to do some type of hot fix for a bug in production, you want to have environments, or like at least a strategy to have these environments be readily made to support these types of needs. So production support needs to be refreshed or synced from production as often as possible. So having a strategy to get the impacted accounts or something like that into one of these pooled dev orgs is a great way to manage production support rather than having like a dedicated full copy for it. The same story for training. If you are, maybe using a partial copy to have a lot of training data in there and have a lot of users in there creating new stuff, decide where this is going to be and how you're going to get it up to date with either the latest production data or the latest release that's about to be pushed to production that you need to do training on there before it goes live. If you don't have a good option for dedicated sandboxes, have a standard procedure to create them on demand. So that would be with like the pooling or the seeding constructs that we talked about before. A best-in-class path to production looks like this. So a bit more explanation on what's going on from the slide earlier. You'll have feature branches. These are like your dev and Scratch orgs, and you make changes to an org that's a subset of the master data, so master production data and metadata. Do what you can to make your dev and Scratch orgs as like production as needed to be for the work. Don't have people creating all their own record data to do tests. Have automation or some type of seeding process to set that up to eliminate that time suck and make the the dev environments more rich, more real like production, which will help you cut down on errors that are maybe you're seeing as you merge up the landscape. And you want to have one branch per contributor per sprint. So one branch for an admin, one for a developer and I have sprint in quotation marks because I'm not necessarily always following agile, but your contributors on your team probably have like a single unit of work they need to get done for a project. That could be something that takes them a day or something that takes them 3 or 4 weeks, but that they're going to be working on kind of one dedicated feature or one thing that other people need to use. You want to make a Scratch org or a dev org for that type of unit of work. Then after you've have things working really well for your feature branches, your test environments, what you want to do with these is you want to package completed features from these feature branches into releases. So the feature branches are going to be pushing into a merge environment or an integration org where you're going to verify that all the stuff that's being built is good and ready to work together. And then you'll package all of the different new features and functions that are coming from your team into a release. You'll then move that up the landscape to perform systems integration testing. So like if Salesforce is working with an ERP or a provisioning system or some type of human capital system like Workday or something like that, you can make sure that the changes and updates that you're performing in Salesforce are still functioning and working with these integrated systems. And you want a dedicated UAT org for end users to verify releases. So UAT is super valuable, and I see it being skipped out on a lot of times, which basically just makes a mess in production and makes your end users not happy, which no one really wants. And best in class will also have a staging environment as well. So it's going to collect all the features that have passed testing, effectively test the impact of a deployment to production, and you can perform further regression testing after you have pushed that new big package into staging to make sure that the impact to production is minimal. And then that makes production where everything is beautiful and nothing hurts.
Derek, I have one question. Sorry to interrupt. Why can't staging be your testing environment?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I do have like regression testing as part of this, but you don't want to have people generating a whole lot of extra data or potentially making changes or anything like that inside of staging. Staging, a true staging environment is really to just test, do a dry run of a big package release to production. And if you're doing like true CI/CD, this is how you're going to verify that there's going to be no impact. And a lot of times this regression testing is automated. So you'll have some type of scripts to maybe run through, the impact of, can I still make an opportunity, or, things like that, to make sure that nothing's, going to be blown out of production. And you want this to be as in sync with prod as possible, and doing more things like UAT or SIT inside of staging can kind of muddy up that relationship. So, if you can afford it, having just a dedicated staging environment is, best in class way to do this. So thanks for the question. And we're about wrapping up. Did I go the right way? Yeah, so here we go. So we do have 3 more classes in the series. We're going to do release management here in a couple of weeks. We'll talk more in depth about CI/CD and version control later. And we'll talk about testing strategies to finally wrap up. And you can find our first session at the sign up page. There should be a recording of it there. And Shannon, do you have anything else you want to kind of add in here? I guess, too, if you've attended this and you think that I know what I'm talking about, you can sign up to have a change management audit with me, where we'll talk through what your company's current strategy is, and maybe understand like what the next steps are into becoming best in class.
Yeah, and I think that was it for this week. Thank you so much, Derek, for this second session. If there are any questions, please let us know. And otherwise, I will wish you a very good Thursday and hopefully see you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we do have a couple minutes for questions, but. All right, well, seems like there's maybe no questions. I'll still hang out for the 1 minute. And thanks for attending today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks if you're satisfied.
All right, thank you so much, guys, and see you next time.
All right, bye everyone.